Thank you very much again to all four of the presenters. Can we give them another round of applause? So we have time for questions. If anybody wants to start off with questions for any of the presenters.
I can start with two questions, and then maybe someone else would. And the questions are for Paul and for Ileana. I'm just curious, you talk about the collaboration in the moment of reading, no? But then you were talking about two different relation of the narrative with temporality. And I just want to know if you have like studied that more in depth, that collaboration, but the differences of that collaboration when the narrative is linear and when the narrative is more chaotic, no? Since in one of them it says that the body is speaking more, is interfering more. And for Ileana, also in relation to what Malabou says about wonder, no, that she apparently thinks that wonder can be a way to counteract indifference. And the question that I ask myself sometimes with these testimonies and very clear representations, no, is what does it happen to the listener or to the viewer, no? I mean, is that really that wonder is effective in terms of an understanding, or when that happens, maybe sometimes we don't want to hear anymore, no? And I'm thinking about in terms of transmission of memory, for example, or transmission of testimonies.
So if I stand up. So that's a wonderful question. Thank you very much. In my book, I've got a whole chapter on the temporality of the decentered brain and how a narrative helps to organize our sense of time and our sense of time in relationship to others, and another chapter on intersubjectivity and the processes of doubling. What links them is that our shared sense of time is how we intertwine, one of the ways in which we intertwine with each other intersubjectively. And what I'm interested in exploring in the book in general, but in both of these chapters in different ways, is how narratives can structure time and relations in different ways that extend from, on the one pole, consonance, harmony, sympathy, unity. On the other hand, disruption, transgression, fragmentation, and how the relationship between the two of them, you see in different narratives the way in which they structure time and structure relations with others. How to say this quickly? I mean, in trauma literature, it seems to me that there's an interesting argument about both temporality and intersubjectivity that relate to your question. Is there something essential about narratives that are disruptive? Are they truer to the traumatic experience? Or is there some ways in which narratives help consistency building, making meaning to cure and recover? And it seems to me that in terms of the temporality of narrative, the way that narratives can create concord out of the discord of temporal moments, both of those things are true. And what we need is a model that I'm trying to provide for how these disjunctions and coordinations in experience and in narrative and in neurobiology interact with each other. So rather than saying narrative should be one or rather the other, how does the way in which narrative makes time's disjunctions productive, how can that be seen working in disjunctive narratives or in narratives of consonance in different kinds of ways for different purposes, without saying that narrative must be one or the other? Analogously, in the way in which narratives bring us in relationship with each other, there are a number of philosophers and psychologists who say narratives promote empathy because they bring us in relationship with each other. Well, yes, but empathy is contradictory, because empathy is a process of doubling. I feel another's pain as my own in ways that the quotations from Boland's were trying to suggest. And reading is similarly a doubling process where I experience another world but as if it were my own. And this doubling can take lots of different forms. And I think rather than saying all narratives should, rather than saying, and when I said that, you know, the beneficial and the noxious capacities of narrative doubling are both two sides of the same coin, I was trying to suggest that in ways that overly simplistic notions that fiction is a simulation of other minds, therefore it makes us better people, don't get at. But this whole notion of doubling can be enacted in a lot of different ways that my model was trying to describe the range of, if that gets at your question.
In this particular piece by Malabou, what she's trying to figure out is where are emotions located in the body, and goes through the history of philosophy, telling you what Leibniz thought, what Descartes thought, what so on and so forth. And she reaches the conclusion that wonder is the emotion par excellence, because there is no judgment implicit in it. And therefore, it brings together you to yourself, you and the other in you, and you and the others of the world, right? So then she works on the relationship between like self-love or auto-affect that she calls, and then hetero-affect, which is the love for others. I find that I use that as the principle that makes solidarity with the other possible. It is the moment in which whatever you're feeling, I am feeling. And that's the reason why I take it to aesthetics and to the movies and to poetry. Because then you're overtaken by the emotion of the other. And the fluids in your body are the fluids in the other person's body. I haven't reached the brain yet. I mean, Malabou reaches the brain later on in another articles, right? But what I liked best about this piece is that mainly the moment where Descartes says that emotions are felt all over the body. And some of them are visible, and some of them are invisible. And the visible ones have to do with your muscles, right? That is what we see. That's what I see when I am studying Romagos. I can see his face twisting. I can see him being uncomfortable. Like I can see him sobbing. I can hear it, right? He takes me with it. But what is really working at is the internal emotions, the internal fluids, what he calls the animal spirits that you don't see. The circulation of the blood you don't see and can give you a heart attack. Digestion you don't see, and that can give you stomach troubles. The metabolism you don't see, and it can. And that's what that is what I am trying to work out. The other thing that I see is that I am using most women in my research. And it's not done on purpose. It's sort of like they found me instead of me looking for them. And there is the question of the throat, how the throat works, right? How when somebody speaks, it's important because there is flesh there, because it's saliva there, because there are the lungs there. And then people do that, right? They are transmitting emotions. So that's where I am sort of going, mainly because I am absolutely bored of the direct political discourse. So I want to find another place for the political. And so I'm finding it in emotions.
Actually, Ileana, I don't know if you want to stay up there. I had a question. First of all, I loved your talk so much. Thank you. And I wanted to continue sort of Anna's question about wonderment. Because during your talk, I was kind of thinking it in terms of like the difference between the sublime and the beautiful, right? In the sense that the sublime, in like your reaction to something that stops you, right? There's that sense of overwhelming. But there seems to be a key difference, though, because Kant will say part of it is that then that overwhelming is overwhelmed, right? Because you step to the edge of the cliff, but then you step back, and there's sort of, it's pleasurable, that overwhelming in some sense. But when you talk about like hyper or hetero affect, sometimes you fall down, like if you're taking a selfie and you back up too far. But with this hetero affect or this sort of internal non-self that's from within, right? There seems to be kind of an ethical component to what you're saying, where there's a fidelity to that non-self from within, right? That opens you up to like loving your neighbor as yourself or something along those lines. And so maybe I'm pushing it towards sort of the inner Kierkegaard that I see in like the title with Trembling and repetition and so on. Would you say that that's where ethics would be located, in sort of that dedication to the non that's within the self, rather than to the project of the self as a historical thing?
Self-love and love of others are very tricky, because there is another in you that you don't know. And when you don't love that other in you, then wonder helps you love it, right? Get in touch with it. Insofar as the sublime and the beauty and the sublime, I am thinking about two examples, mainly from children. When a child goes cyanotic, right, can't breathe, because the emotion is so strong, he can have a heart attack, right? That's the sublime. That's the reason why I believe that sometimes you stop it, but sometimes you fall down the cliff, right? And insofar as heteroaffect, the best example I have is, how many of you have children here? A child says, "Mama, it hurts us." You say, "No, no, no, it hurts you." He says, "No, it hurts us." No. At that point, the child doesn't make a distinction between himself and the other, right? There's no distance whatsoever, right? That's wonder. That's wonder, right? That's something like. It comes from Levinas mainly, and it comes from the whole thing about the Jewish Shoah and so on and so forth that Mala was taken. But I think it applies to every kind of binary. It can break down men, women, feminine, masculine, black, white. Although there's, when you, depending on the location, when you talk about heteroaffect, if you're a woman, perhaps you're thinking about a man. If you're white, perhaps you're thinking about a black, etc. Right? But all of that is collapsible in her.
I have one for Dr. Armstrong. I'm fascinated by the neuroscience that you weave into the narrative, and I very much appreciate that tapestry that you gave us. But you distinctly avoided the neuroscience concept of mirror neurons in the mirror neuron network. Can you explain why?
Time. There wasn't enough time. But the chapter on intersubjectivity, and also in the previous book, How Literature Plays with the Brain, there's a long discussion of the mirror neuron research. The mirror neuron research, as some of you may know, is controversial. It is. There's Gregory Hickok's Myth of Mirror Neurons book, which recently came out in his 8 Reasons Why Mirror Neurons Are Wrong. It's classic article. Briefly. Does everybody know what mirror neurons are? No, they don't. Giacomo Rezzoletti and his group in Parma discovered that in the motor cortex of the macaque monkey, there are certain neurons that fired not only in performing an action, but also when they observed the action being performed. And various people got really carried away, particularly Vittorio Galizzi, who's one of the big advocates of it, said, this is the biological basis of intersubjectivity. Well, it's resulted in a large and controversial debate. The best popular book, I think, explaining the pros are by Marco Iacoboni, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA, called Mirroring People. Wonderful book. And the best skeptical reply is, as I was saying before, Gregory Hickok, who's a neuroscientist from UC San Diego, who originally wrote a book, wrote an article, 8 Reasons Why Mirror Neurons Are Wrong, and then he published this book, The Myth of Mirror Neurons. The argument against is that it's possible for people that have various incapacities in their motor cortex still to understand gestures. You know? It's not entirely the case that you need the motor capacities to understand a gesture of others. It's also the case that motor mirroring responses, although useful, are not necessary. If I raise my hand, your motor mirror neurons correlating the hand will be raised. But what am I doing? Am I voting? Do I want you to tell me, do I want you to call on me in class? Or am I just stretching? It's not sufficient by itself. This is Patricia Churchland's objection to mirror neurons. So this is to suggest some of the scientific and philosophical debate about them. For my purposes as a literary theorist, what's interesting is that the mirroring effects, the embodied mirroring effects that the mirror neuron research disclosed, help to explain why some narratives really seem to capture us in an embodied way. You have Aristotle talks about catharsis being invoking pity and fear, and the research I was talking about actually about how there's evidence of our response to the brain's response to linguistic action has to do with those effects, but they are but they are always as if experiences. You don't experience what the tragic hero is going through. You experience them as if. You can cry in response to a tragic hero's awful experiences, and they can be feeling that embodied, but they are, again, doubling experiences, as if experiences. And that as if gives the possibility of play and reconfiguration and the possibility of structuring them in the range of different manners in which I was trying to get at in responding to Anna's question, where you can either be in a classically realistic narrative, be made to feel one with the character's travails, or in a modernist narrative, you can play with it. They play with the disruptions so that you can be self-conscious about what's going on that's not you. And the sense of the doubleness, I think, actually is implicit in the mirror neuron research. Because in the mirror neuron research, one of the questions is, okay, if our mirror neurons are responding to another person's action, why don't we lose a sense of self and other? And in fact, one of the dangers of contagion I was talking about is that there can be that sort of sense of oneness, but only a subset of the neurons fire as if you were acting not the same ones. And there's also some evidence that when you observe somebody's actions, there's not only mirroring, but there's also inhibition actions that are the neurons that fire. And it seems to me that those key differences that I discuss at greater length in how literature plays with the brain also contribute to how these as-if effects. It is you're re-experiencing in a narrative something as if it were your own, which is this doubling, which then opens up all sorts of different possibilities, from immersion to self-reflection, from being involved to being reflective, that the whole range of narrative activity displays. So that's a short answer, but there's much more there. And then I teach a course called Neuroscience and Reading. We spend 3 weeks on empathy, mirror neurons, and the contradictions of doubling self and other. So it's a very rich area. So thank you.
That's all the time we have, unfortunately, for questions right now. So we're going to transition to the next session.